Hey, mental workers, and welcome back to Mental Work. Today, I'm very excited to be sharing the microphone with Ceara Rickard. And Ceara, hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. And today we're going to be talking to you about what to do when a personal crisis comes your way and you've got an active caseload. So you are actively seeing clients and you've got something that just hits you out of nowhere. And Ceara, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're here?
I'm a psychologist. I've been working for a few years now on and off due to my own health issues. I'm also very much interested in supporting provisional and early career psychologists. And I'm also both a policy nerd, which is where I work in my day-to-day life now, and an activist around voluntary assisted dying legislation. And that touches on why I thought it might be useful for me to talk about this topic. I'm dying. I have metastatic breast cancer, which is a terminal illness. And I also have really severe autoimmune problems with a diagnosis of Evans syndrome, where my body just draws my blood, which happens very suddenly. So you can imagine with a caseload that's really difficult. I've had multiple times where I've just been at work going about my life. Having had a blood test, I'll get a phone call from a specialist and be told I have to go immediately to hospital.
Wow.
So managing a caseload with that has its challenges.
It would be fair to say that Ceara has some experience with the topic.
Just a little, yes.
So with this episode, I'm hoping that we can first draw on Ceara's experiences. And Ceara, I just know you're very involved in this area as well. Like you said, you're an activist. Just off air, you were telling me that you were submitting, I'm going to say submissions to Parliament. And so this is something that you are well versed in talking about. And I hope that listeners can take away some practical things to help them with their own experiences. And if they're actually going through something similar, I really hope that they can relate and take something away to put into their own practice and lives. With that in mind, I'm interested to know, just from, I guess, the start, like did your illnesses strike you suddenly in your kind of early career phase or?
Yes. So I first developed Evans syndrome right in the middle of my 4+2.
Wow.
Yeah, I'd had a previous autoimmune issue called ITP where my body kills off platelets. And I'd had a couple of days in hospital like years before and then went into remission. Doctors told me they thought it probably wasn't going to come back. So I was just going about my life. I think I'd had a case conference that morning and I remember sitting with my manager saying, Nikki, I've noticed a few bruises on my arms and I haven't hit anything. I'm wondering if this autoimmune thing might be back. I'm going to go get a blood test tomorrow. I just want to give you a heads up because if it is back, then I might need some treatment. And we carried on with the conversation, didn't think much of it, to be honest. The next day, I went and got a blood test and then within a couple of hours, I had a call from a haematologist telling me that I needed to be admitted to hospital immediately. I said, but I'm at work. And they're like, yes, you need to stop that and come home and pack your gear and then come to emergency. We're waiting for you.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, so just like that, I had no notice. And so then off I trot to hospital and the next thing I know, I'm not just killing off platelets, which was what was causing the bruises. I was experiencing something called a hemolytic crisis, which is when you don't have enough blood. So my immune system was killing off my red blood cells, which for those of you who might not be as familiar with biology, you need red blood to live. I was so unwell that I could not even hold my phone. I was just completely down for the count and it was so quick.
Well, shit. So, I mean, just to kind of set the scene as well, like with 4+2, that it's very onerous. There are lots of requirements. You need to make sure you're accruing hours as you go along and recording those hours and meeting your obligations. And so you were actively seeing people at this time?
Yes. I had a full and active, very busy caseload of young people and families at the time.
And then you're hit by this.
Yep, hit by that right at the 1 year mark.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, it was not a good time. And at the time, I went from just going along, doing all the things I needed to do. My biggest worry was, I'd better get onto those case reports soon, to doctors in hospital saying that I was, 24 hours from death if I wasn't having lots of blood transfusions at any given moment. And we weren't entirely sure that I'd pull through.
When I hear that, I feel terrified. Like, what was your response in that moment?
Probably less terrified than you think. Part of my treatment was being on really high doses of steroids, which frankly make you quite high.
Nice.
A really common side effect of high doses of steroids is actually hypomania, mania, or psychosis at really high doses, like about a third of people. And I was quite able to go, I'm still reality testing, so I'm not psychotic. I'm just a bit speedy and bossy and I can't sleep. I think I'm hypomanic.
Nice self-assessment.
Yeah, to be a typical psychologist.
Yeah, totally.
But of course that brought, as well as sleeplessness, a little bit of euphoria and a feeling of not being quite myself, which at the time both added to my frustration because I couldn't sleep and my thinking was just slightly odd and I kept wanting to go for a run but I couldn't walk. And at the same time, it was also another sign to me of, I'm really dealing with big stuff and I need to let myself recover. So it was a very interesting experience. And at the time, I did think about my clients, the work that I like to do and was doing at the time was very much working with people with quite high and complex mental health needs. And I built a really good relationship with clients on my caseload. So even though I was quite ill, I still had this worry for my clients of, will they be okay without me there? For me, I was quite lucky in that I worked with an amazing team. We had partnerships with other agencies who also provided care. And I had a real trust in my team that even though I was down for the count, that my team would be able to pick up my clients and do some therapeutic holding at a minimum.
It sounds like that was really helpful for you to know, because when we think about anxiety, we think, oh gosh, what's the worst case scenario? And could I cope with that? And it sounds like being able to have, knowing that your team was available to assist was okay, we could actually deal with this. Is that right?
Yeah, it made a huge difference. And the other thing that was quite important for me, and this is an interesting thing with workplaces, right? So in general, of course, we have the right to privacy and confidentiality too, much like our clients. I'm not obligated to tell clients, I've had this illness. However, for me, it was actually really important for work to let clients know why I'd suddenly disappeared.
What was that?
I think it's because I didn't want them to feel that I had just got sick of my job and left. I didn't want them to think that, that anything short of a really significant crisis would stop me from being there to work with them and support them.
Yeah.
And also my area of work is a lot with young people who've had lots of complex trauma, who have difficulties with being abandoned by caring figures in their life. And so for me, I really wanted these wonderful young people who I've worked with to understand that it wasn't me purposefully abandoning them.
Yeah. And what we know about children and young people who have these complex situations where they have faced abandonment is that it could be quite understandable for them to draw that conclusion. So for you, you're trying to help them, I guess, draw a more correct conclusion.
Yeah, very much so. And of course, my work is probably a little bit more hesitant to give as much information.
Interesting.
I'm pretty open. And that makes it a lot easier because I was very comfortable with my clients being aware of the fact that my body was trying to kill me. And the other thing I had to think about as well with work is that, you know, my work team are really close-knit. They really care about me. And so we also needed to think about how much information they could give my clients that felt psychologically safe to my colleagues in session, because they're having to navigate their own feelings of distress and worry about me suddenly being in hospital at death's door. So what do they tell clients where they're able to stay regulated themselves in session?
Yeah, it sounds like it would be quite an individual thing, I guess. Some people might be quite natural and quite adept at regulating their emotions when saying, like, Ceara is facing an illness where she might not come out the other side. But some other people might find that that's actually too much for them.
Yeah, and where I left it with my team was to essentially give them permission to feel out what they felt was appropriate for each individual person who I worked with, and with the clinician who'd taken over. For me, that was a way of ensuring that they were aware that they could tell clients that I wouldn't be distressed if they gave information, that I'd given consent for that information to be shared. But also it gave them the autonomy and respect for their clinical reasoning and their ability to navigate issues with clients themselves, rather than me dictating, well, this is what you must tell everyone on my caseload. And, you know, that worked quite well. In the end, I had to take a year off my internship.
I was going to say, like, I wondered if there are any other ethical things, because you probably weren't able to give clients a sense of when you'd be back. And I imagine clients would be like, oh, maybe I'm happy to wait. Like, maybe Ceara will be back like next week. But it was actually a year. How was navigating that?
My workplace were really, really aware of where I was at. So they knew that I was really sick. They knew that I could be off for who knows how long. And so they were able to communicate that reasonably well. And because of the specific caseload I worked with at the time, it wasn't a caseload that you could just, you know, say, oh, well, you can come back when Ceara's back. These were people with really quite high risk and quite significant needs around care. If someone is off work for a month, for example, we don't generally pause the work in that time. We try to pick it up where we can, or at least make contact. So my colleagues were able to pick up my caseload and worked with the clients that I'd left behind around being okay to see someone new. And that meant they had to carefully build the relationships and very carefully just navigate working with a new person when they built quite a strong relationship with me. What really helped that, and this is something that I think is quite important, was that I was very careful to talk about what a wonderful team I have with all of my clients. Wherever possible, I introduced clients to colleagues because we worked in a high-intensity service. If someone just went on holiday, we'd often need to do handovers. So as a service as a whole, we were very careful about ensuring that clients were aware that, hey, we work in a team. If someone's not around, it might mean that you see someone else in the team. Oh, look, here's another team member. Let's introduce you.
So clients are already broadly familiar with this. You're kind of socializing them to how you guys work.
Yes, and that was so helpful and turned out to be really quite important, because it meant that they already had the foundation to build a trusting therapeutic relationship with someone new. And in the end, it worked quite well. By the time I came back, first of all, I was really unwell. So my previous role before I was injured was completely outreach, providing quite intensive psychosocial supports to young people and families, which could see me bushwalking whilst having therapeutic conversations, or having sessions in a home halfway up a mountain in the middle of nowhere. And when I first started to recover, I'd been so unwell that all my muscles wasted. I had to relearn how to walk again. I had really severe fatigue. So, of course, working in an intensive outreach mental health service was completely impossible. Even when I first started coming back to work, I actually came back doing service development. We'd won a new tender for a new mental health service, and the timing worked out really well. I could work from home really part-time, slowly build up, putting this new service back together.
What was it like for you to actually have that and actually be kind of slapped by that reality in a way and be like, wow, I cannot actually do this same job. I'm going to need to do a different job. What was that like for you?
It wasn't too bad, actually. You'd think that would be a really big blow. But I could still see a future where I could come back and work with clients just in a slightly different capacity. So even though I loved doing the really intensive therapeutic outreach work, I still felt that I could eventually come back to doing something therapeutic. And so it wasn't too bad. It was more like, well, this is really frustrating because I'd really like to be able to go on bushwalks just for myself, let alone with clients. So the process of rehabilitation can be really frustrating. Like when I first started back at work, it was probably 3 or 4 months after I'd gotten out of hospital. I could do 2 hours a day. And by the end of that, I was wiped out for the rest of the day and had to go to bed. I was so exhausted. And, you never recover as quickly as you'd like when you've been that unwell, I think. So I had to think about, well, how do I get from where I am now to where I'd like to be, which is back working with clients. And because we'd won this new service and I was in a position to just not do client-facing work for 6 or 8 months, I was incredibly fortunate. And I already had a bit of experience in developing new mental health services. I'd written the service manual for the previous service I'd been working in where I was doing my 4+2. I spent, my first 6 or 8 months in the role before starting my 4+2 just putting together policy, procedure, service manuals, that sort of thing. So I was like, oh, okay, I can do that again and expand that skill set. So I was really, really lucky.
It sounds like that really helped. So actually, okay, I can't do that job, but I can do something else. And it sounds like it was really engaging and kind of a pleasurable job for you that you could really sink your teeth into.
Yeah, it was. And for me, that's about my values. So some of the things that really attract me about psychology is, one, I find people fascinating, but more importantly is I have this bizarre desire to try to leave the world better than I found it. So whilst I find psychology absolutely fascinating because I'm also a massive nerd and psychology is a very nerdy profession.
It really is.
Oh, it's super nerdy. Like, oh, wow, journal articles. Oh, I've got a minor question time to hit Google Scholar. Like, who does that? So there's that kind of more, I guess, scientific aspect and, my liking for people and finding people really interesting. But there's also this desire to make the world better. And for me, if I'm developing, say, a really solid mental health service where I'm putting in all the systems that help other clinicians be able to do the work really well and be well supported and, know how to manage XYZ issue, know how to comply with data collections so they're working in a way that's really solid and ethical, then that's tapping into that value as well as my psychology skills and the nerdy stuff. It means that I don't get the same sort of joy of directly seeing someone figure out who they want to be and moving forward in their lives in a way that's really meaningful to them. But I get a lot of other benefits from it. And that really helped. Eventually, though, with that period of illness, I got to a point where I was ready to do clinical work again, which was so exciting. And I just stepped into a clinician role in the service I developed. I think I'd written the draft of the position description of the job I got.
Nice.
Yeah, and then I moved into the new service as a clinician there and built up a full caseload, had a really good time. But I had this lingering awareness that Evans syndrome is not curable. Evans syndrome tends to have a pattern of relapse and remissions, and I'd already experienced one sudden and life-threatening relapse. So something that I worked through in internal supervision, in external supervision, in my own personal therapy, was what do I do if or probably when this happens again? How do I work with a caseload where, young people aged 12 to 25, the most common diagnostic label they had was borderline personality disorder. They all had, experiences of things like complex trauma, all presentations that meant I really needed to be able to be as reliable as possible. So how do I navigate that whilst also, having this lingering awareness that I could just, drop off the perch at any time?
And did you come to a satisfying conclusion with that? Like, how would you?
Yeah, look, I did. Part of my thinking was to acknowledge the fact that young people are humans and getting sick is part of the human experience. And I really reflected on things like whether or not it's ableist to assume that clients just simply won't be able to cope if I, as a therapist, can't be there. Like, I think it's really paternalistic to assume that our caseloads will never be able to cope. Oh, no, this therapist who we see, my service, it was a bit more than an hour a week, but, this therapist that we see isn't there. Oh, no, what shall I do? My life is over. No, I think that's really egotistical, frankly, if we think that way. I also think that it diminishes the resilience and capacity of clients. Real life happens. We all die eventually. We all get sick. And, why pretend that our clients are so fragile that they can't cope with that reality?
I agree. Like, it really flies in the face of a strengths-based approach and how we think about our clients as being resilient as well and having the capacity to cope on their own. And even at the most basic level, like, I haven't had severe illness like you've had, but even me being like, okay, I'm sick for this day, and then having that anxiety that comes with it and being like, oh, I'm not there for my clients. Like, I'm trying to be consistent. I've gone through a similar thought process and being like, look, they'll be okay. They've survived in their life this far. They'll be okay without me for one day. We'll reschedule. It'll be cool.
Yeah. And I think, like, at the same time, for me, the chances of me disappearing were rather higher than the general population. So I did have to think about, well, okay, yes, that's true. Our clients are really resilient. And also, though, I still felt they had the right to be aware that I had this stuff that might happen to me where I might disappear. So with my new caseload, I just told them, I said, look, I've got this autoimmune condition. It's called Evans syndrome. And I was just really open and transparent and said, look, there may come a time where I disappear really suddenly. We might be in the middle of really important stuff. Know that if that happens, the only reason I can think of that happening is that I've had a relapse and I've gotten sick again. And if that happens, it will be really sudden. And I want you to be aware, because I feel you've got the right to choose whether to continue to see me or not, just knowing that this could happen.
So it's a very values-based, a very like human rights-based approach. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And maybe this is something that listeners can relate to as well, but generally as early career therapists, we're advised to make very deliberate self-disclosures. And if erring on the side of caution, it's like, don't do it unless you can explicitly be like, this is beneficial for the client. And it sounds like in your role, in your position, that it was beneficial for clients to know. But I just wondered whether like you felt any kind of pushback from disclosing this much.
I didn't feel much pushback from disclosing. I suppose for me, I am comfortable working with relatively close boundaries. However, I'm also very thoughtful about issues around disclosure. So whilst I probably disclose more than some therapists, I certainly don't believe in the blank face approach to therapy. gosh, young people will see through that in a minute anyway. I also tend to feel that some of the I guess, very black and white views around self-disclosure are more about protecting us from being vulnerable than genuinely in service of the client. When I think about disclosure, I talk it through in supervision internally, externally. I think about it really carefully. I go through steps to ethical decision making. For example, the ethicist Ken Pope in the USA has a really great 17 steps to ethical decision making that you can take, and I'll go through those if I'm thinking about something. But at the end of the day, for me, I'm comfortable with boundary crossings if they're not a boundary violation. So boundary crossing is, a disclosure or something that might be seen as crossing a boundary, but it's not violating it. It's doing something that is to the benefit of clients in a really thoughtful and mindful way. For me, disclosing was very much about, well, if I were a client, if I was seeing someone as a therapist, would I like to know if they had something that means they might disappear? Would anyone, is that something that any reasonable person would want to know? Would it be creating unnecessary distress in a client to know that their therapist is sick, or will it be allowing them to engage in informed consent? So, in weighing that up, I, thought about my values and thought about that idea around social justice and not treating our clients as less than. And so my conclusion was, well, they do deserve that simple respect of just knowing and then having the choice to do whatever they wanted with that knowledge. And that knowing of clients did turn out to be quite important, because in 2020, I'd finished my 4+2, I had my general registration, and then a few months later, I got told I was terminally ill. So I, again, was off work quite suddenly. So just after I got my general registration, I started getting pain down one leg from time to time, a bit of numbness, tingling, just if I sat on bad seating, didn't think much of it. Only got worse. So I ended up getting an MRI thinking, I've probably got a bulgy disc, or I've done something to my back that's pressing on nerves. No, it turns out when you have metastatic breast cancer that spread to your bones, that also causes pressure on nerves and pain.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So in the space of just a few hours, I went from, I've probably got a bulgy disc, time to get an MRI, to, oh, shit, I'm terminally ill.
How does one respond to hearing that you're terminally ill?
I think I nodded and contained myself. Then I started crying. Then I called my mum, and then we all started crying. Then my oncologist was a little bit glassy-eyed. She'd been my hematologist already, so she'd known me for 5 years of Evans syndrome, where I had other relapses that hadn't been as severe. I knew I had some sort of cancer before I went and got my full diagnosis. I had my MRI. The radiologist pulled me aside and said, look, we've found something in your spine. We think it's cancer. And this was actually it was just before I was due to go into work for my last day before going off on holidays. Okay. So I went from being told I probably had some sort of cancer in my spine to going to the office. And I told the manager on my team, it was over Christmas. This was the 2nd of January. So we had a bit of a skeleton staff. So one of the managers was available. So I grabbed her and said, look, they think they found cancer. I'm going to just finish off all the handover things that I was already preparing before my holiday. Can you please call my afternoon client, let them know I won't be there because I don't know what's going on yet. And this particular client would see through me in a second if I called them and just cancelled out of the blue. And I'm not ready for that. So I let the manager make that call. Wrote up handovers, didn't disclose to my own supervisor for when she came back to leave what was happening, because I didn't know what it was yet. So I didn't want her to potentially check her emails on holiday and see anything scary. So it was just very routine. This client needs this one needs that, this thing's due in, 3 weeks. Then I went straight from work to see my oncologist, which is when she told me I was terminally ill. I guess the best possible timing for one of the most awful things in my life, because I'd already handily done all my handovers. The other thing is that after developing Evans syndrome, initially I have always been very careful to stay quite current and up to date on, client records, and basically with the understanding that I could go down at any time.
Yeah.
So I needed people to be able to pick up the work. So the way I write notes is really careful. The way I'd talk to my team around, caseload work was always quite structured in a way to make it easier for someone else to pick up the work, basically.
I mean, yeah, that's fantastic. So having that, I guess, foresight to actually be like, look, somebody could legit pick up this case, look at it and continue treatment.
Yep. And good job, past Ceara. That worked really well, actually.
Yeah, totally. There are a few things here, Ceara. Like, I just want to kind of summarize the listeners so far, kind of the helpful things that have been present in your experiences. It sounds like the workplace, the helpful, supportive workplace, having processes in place, being able to have that autonomy to be able to self-disclose in a meaningful, beneficial way. These were really helpful things. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm really struck as well by like, when I hear you talk about this now, like you actually sound pretty chipper. I'm sure like at the time it wasn't like a chipper experience, but I do wonder, like, did you have other supports in place that really helped you through this time? Or like, are you a naturally like chipper, resilient, like excellent mindset kind of person?
I mean, I think like most of us, I've had my experiences of, anxiety and being really perfectionistic. And at the same time, when I got my cancer diagnosis, I'd already had to come to terms with the fact that I could fall over and die like any time from Evans syndrome. So my cancer diagnosis was a huge shock. I think the day I got it, I think I spent like the next 3 days pretty much in bed, just miserable and letting myself be miserable, making space for the misery. I had panic attacks, and then I'd bring out my bag of tricks, fly up a balloon to help my breathing, made space for all the feelings. But I think for me that I'm pretty resilient. I'd already come to terms with my mortality. So this was just one more thing. I do have quite good supports in my life. I've got a really supportive husband. My family, for the most part, are really supportive. I've got close friends. My oncologist was previously my hematologist. So we had 5 years of, me receiving really good care. The same with my GP. On and off, I've had plenty of my own therapy as well. So I had a really good team of supportive people around me. Reflecting on it, I remember at the time, I was thinking, wow, this is really awful that I've got this happening. And yet I felt like my mental health was still better than that of a lot of people that I worked with. I had less pain and distress than, anyone on my caseload who I worked with who had to live with really, really painful symptoms. I think it really helped that my area of interest in therapy is with working with people with really painful things, because it meant that I'd had to do a lot of my own work about, well, how do you hold really painful things? And here was an opportunity to put what I already knew into practice. So I did a lot of radical acceptance in myself, a lot of radical acceptance, a lot of mindfulness, a lot of making room for painful feelings instead of avoiding them. It meant that I was able to process this new reality and identity of me as someone dying of cancer probably more quickly than I might have otherwise.
Yeah, I'm really pleased for you with that. And I mean, it is like proof in the pudding for the stuff that we tell our clients as well. Like, I always try and say like this painful feeling, like lean into it, make space for it. And we assume that by doing that the struggle will actually be less than trying to actively push against it. And it really sounds like that was true for you.
Yeah. And when I got told I was terminally ill, I was going, well, shit, now I've got metastatic breast cancer. But I still have Evans syndrome as well, which could also relapse at any time. And I sort of knew more or less then and there that this was it for me as a therapist with young people with complex presentations. So I made the decision very early on that it wasn't the right choice for me to continue doing therapy work.
Okay. And how was dealing with that, like coming to that realization for you?
It was honestly, it was one of the worst things about my diagnosis to go, shit, I've just done all of this
Yes,
work.
exactly. Yeah.
I love doing therapy work. It's just such a wonderful, delightful, sometimes painful, but always really incredible experience to be there, to support people, really, to be the people they want to be. And here I was going, well, I'm not going to do that anymore. It was really, really hard. Like, I still sometimes feel really sad about it. And especially with the pandemic, I've got to go, there's this massive shortage of psychologists. Here I am with all these skills, all this knowledge, hard won over, many years of working. Even before I started my 4+2, I'd built a really solid career in mental health. And I'm not providing therapy when there's massive waiting lists. At times, that's been quite hard. And I've had to stand back and go, well, hang on, Ceara, you've got all this other stuff going on. Is it really fair to you to be doing that? Yes, there's unmet need. There'll always be unmet need. We cannot be all things to all people. It's actually okay to not go back to doing that work when doing that work would be really difficult. Like, part of, for me, I think why I felt okay doing the work with Evans syndrome and an active caseload, but I don't now that I'm dying, was also because even though I think clients are quite capable of understanding reality and coping and that, it also doesn't really feel fair to say, hey, the relationship is the mechanism of therapeutic benefit. So connect with me, but by the way, I'm also dying, so you can connect with me and grieve with me. And it's not in me to hide what I'm experiencing, particularly because when I got my cancer diagnosis, was also around the time when voluntary assisted dying legislation was being debated in Parliament in multiple states across Australia. And I decided to use my lived experience of being someone who was terminally ill to advocate for voluntary assisted dying law. This meant being on media talking about what it's like to be in a dying body. It meant being on the front page of the news in South Australia talking about it. It meant, writing submissions to Parliament about my experiences and why I feel that we need a voluntary assisted dying law. It also meant doing, a lot of research about VAD and thinking through the ethics as well, reading up on discussion papers, journal articles, discussions around the ethics of VAD for practitioners, because I didn't feel that I could advocate for something that I didn't feel would be ethical for me to advocate for with my psychologist hat on.
That's really interesting, like hearing you talk about this, because when I hear this, I actually hear you applying the skills that you learned as a psychologist to this area. Like, it really speaks, I think, to the transferability of skills. Is that kind of broadly resonate with you?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Yep.
Which is like awesome, because even though like you're like, okay, like I cannot do these active clients, and there was like some sadness around that, it sounds like then you pursued this very meaningful thing, which was a social justice thing. And you were also using those hard-earned skills as a psychologist in that area.
Yep, absolutely. And it's meant that I've been able to advocate much more powerfully than I think I might have otherwise. And also the other thing that really helped is that I have all this experience in talking about really difficult concepts like, oh gosh, talking about death. Well, that's just my usual day-to-day suicide risk assessment, So I can talk about topics that are really uncomfortable, and a lot of people who have terminal illness aren't as comfortable talking about what an awful experience that is in media.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Like if you look around at VAD advocates, there are a few of us. We're a small and reasonably close-knit group. I've made some good friends in VAD world, but most of the time the people who you see advocating tend to be more family members who've lost relatives. I suspect that's because it's probably a bit harder to talk about it and to talk about VAD whilst you're also going through the experience of having mental illness. Whereas I was pretty comfortable to talk about it. So that's what I did.
So Ceara, like, I'm actually wondering, like, with this, like with voluntary assisted dying, like, what's in the future for you with this? So is this kind of like your main thing for you? Like, you're really like, okay, I'm on this. I really want to advocate for voluntary assisted dying. Is that still your main kind of like thing to heart? But if not, like, what's in the future for you with, I guess, your illness, your professional identity, personal identity? Sorry, big question.
Yeah, it is a big question. I think for me, VAD is still really important. However, we've kind of won across most of the country. So we got the legislation through in Tasmania, we got it through in South Australia, New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, WA, have all fallen into line. Yeah, huge. Now it's just the territories needing the right to legislate for it. Now we've had a change in federal government, that looks much more likely too. So, the need for advocacy from me has diminished a bit over time just because we've gotten there. Like, there's still a need to make sure the laws are working well. In South Australia, the implementation is much slower than I think it should be. So there's still a need to keep on working to ensure that things are rolling out and as they should, and probably to advocate for some improvements in legislation over time. But it's not, I'm not needing to make the concerted effort that I needed to when they were debating it in Parliament. So what that's meant is I have been a little bit of loose ends, but also at the same time I've had yet another health crisis. So after I get diagnosis, I took 8 months off work. Then I gave work a call and said, look, as you know, I'm not going back to therapy work. But I said, look, I've got all this experience in other areas, as you know. Do you want to see if there's something else I can do? Put out some feelers. If there's something that's needed, just let me know. And I had a phone call an hour later saying, Ceara, come work for us in the National Practice Excellence team. Come work doing quality assurance work.
Cool. Was that of interest to you?
And I said, yeah, because it's developing processes. It's looking at gaps in systems. It's all about, building excellent services. And that's something that I'd already done some work in and really enjoy. So I said, yeah, okay. And the response was, great. How much? Do you want to come full time? I'm like, no, it's not 2 days.
Counter offer, 2 days.
Still dealing with cancer and Evans syndrome here. And I actually ended up supporting my former clinical team to go through their first ever accreditation audits against national mental health standards, wrote a whole lot of policy and procedure, have done, all sorts of things in that role. And we just got word that we'd passed accreditation last year when, oh, look, another blood test and another phone call from my hematologist, oncologist telling me to be admitted immediately. Doesn't work, going about my life and then back in hospital. That was 30th of June last year. And that was the most sick I've ever been. While I was in hospital, I had one thing after another happen. So first it was all of my Evans syndrome stuff flaring up, but then I was also diagnosed with multiple myeloma, which is a bone marrow cancer. It is another terminal illness.
Oh, great.
So now I have right? So I had some chemo while I was in and then I got out and then I had a massive bleed because I had no platelets and my blood couldn't clot and I needed like all these blood transfusions to live. And then I went into multiple organ failure, which they thought was sepsis, but they couldn't find anything. I wasn't responding to any sepsis drugs. Then they told me I was going to die in hospital. Like, it wasn't a you lied. It was, well, we don't think you're going to make it this time. I was so sick. The palliative care team were involved. We had, all of that stuff. I could feel that death was like right there. I could feel in my body just how close I was to just dying.
I'm glad you didn't die, just for the record.
Yeah, I was pretty pleased. I spent, after the not dying, I spent a few months just, going, wow, I can't believe I'm here. But, I was so incredibly unwell.
Yeah, totally.
Like, as sick as a person can be and still survive. Like, with what happened to me, 90+% of people would have died.
Oh my God. I mean, it sounds like it when you say that list of stuff. It's almost like a child is like just picking random like things and then they're like, oh, okay, yeah. We'll add this to the list, Ceara, like this, and this. Okay, go.
Oh, yeah, and there's even more. Okay. Like, I've had pulmonary embolisms, I've had sepsis, I've had multiple organ failure, I've had, oh gosh, I had bilateral knee injury. Just everything happened. My entire body was like, nah. I'm still like, I ended up in hospital all up for about 6 months.
Wow.
During COVID with no visitors.
Oh my God, you poor thing.
Oh, it was not pleasant. I had really severe cognitive fatigue as well. So I couldn't even like read a book to pass the time because my fatigue was so severe that I couldn't concentrate enough to read a book. So I just kind of had to really lie there for most of my time just with TV or music on. And it was a pretty miserable experience, to be honest.
Like when I think of like, I guess it's natural to kind of insert yourself in people's narratives. And I like imagine myself in that situation, just curled into a ball and just like being like, nah, I give up on life. Like, I just wonder whether this taught you like maybe like you're more resilient than you thought you were, or maybe you already thought you were. Like, I don't know, what did it teach you?
Oh, yeah. I already knew I was very resilient. I think the most recent hellish experience has definitely tested my resilience probably the most of any of it. It's been incredibly difficult because it's not just that awareness of my own mortality. It's been that crushing level of just not being able to do anything that I could do in the past. Like, like not even being able to roll over, so, the endless procession of bedpans and barely being able to eat because you can't really sit up enough, being on and off oxygen, all of that. When you can't move, like bodies are pretty gross, right? So you can't move, you can't get out, you can't have a shower, so it's bed bath. But then also there's the risk of like pressure sores and skin infections and all of that stuff that when you're young and able-bodied, you don't really think of that.
No, it's
stuff.
A privilege,
and
yeah.
Then you experience and it's like, oh, wow, okay then. Yeah, like I've been very lucky though. So most of the medical crisis has settled.
I'm really pleased to hear that.
Yeah, my cancer's now stable,
Woohoo!
Which is great. Like the cancer actually, funnily enough, has been the least of my worries. like the metastatic breast cancer, oh yeah, it's everywhere. Yeah, it'll get me eventually. But, I've joked to my hematology team. I'm like, they're like, oh, what do you want to achieve? What's your treatment goal? I'm like, my goal is to live long enough for my breast cancer to get
Okay,
me.
cool. Yeah, nice.
And then they laugh because, they understand why, given everything
totally.
else. So I've gone through rehabilitation. I spent a month on a rehab ward learning how to stand and walk again. I can now do much, much more. Like that's why I'm here talking on a podcast. I can sit up to do a podcast now. How good is that?
Amazing.
I can concentrate well enough to string words together. Wow, what is this? So, it's just been a long, slow process. Like I was discharged from hospital in January. It's now late July. When I was discharged, I needed a walking frame to get around the house. I can now just mobilise around the house without an aid. When I first got out, I couldn't go for a little walk around the shop or anything. I'd use a wheelchair. I now walk around the shops with a walking, like a rollator, so a walker. I managed to go for a 1 kilometre walk last week with my walker around a lake.
Fuck yeah.
Yeah, I know. After everything, it was so good. Like I'm not up to the books yet, but I'll get back there, I think, now. And it is week 11 since my last blood transfusion.
Wow.
Because I stayed killing off red blood cells for quite a lot longer, so I've needed lots of transfusions, and I've always I've been quite anemic. So things are stable. I'm getting back there. Yesterday, I actually had my very first day back at work in my quality
Wow,
role.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm just starting a couple of half days a week and then slowly
You've got to start
up.
somewhere.
Exactly. And, and my new project is around working on some service frameworks for my workplace to use across the country in mental health.
Awesome.
So that's pretty cool. I've got writing a discussion paper in my future, apparently.
Cool. That's awesome. Ceara, all of this is incredible, just hearing this story. And I'm really grateful to have heard this every time in your story when I'm like, okay, this will be it. She's got metastatic breast cancer. Like, that's it, right? And then you were like, oh, but wait, there's more. It's actually just like incredible to hear your progression. And one of the things that I'm taking away from this conversation is how human psychologists are, and how kind of, I almost feel like we're not permitted to kind of be human and have these vulnerabilities and have these things that actually happen in real humans' lives. And it's really amazing just to see you be able to share these with clients in a way that is beneficial to them, and also that you are able to have this workplace that is supportive of you and be able to go through that. Because as we know with early career psychologists, sometimes there are workplaces that are not supportive. It could have been quite different in a different workplace. So thank you. Yeah. And I just wanted to hear from you, like, is there anything that you'd like the listeners to really take away from hearing your story?
Yeah, look, I think there is. There's a few things that I'd like listeners to take away. I think the first and most important thing to take away is that you can't be a therapist and not be a human being. If you don't be a human being, we may as well just be doing all of our therapies through apps. Like, be a human, it's okay. And not only is it okay, I think it's really necessary. So be human and also fight back against the systems that would tell us we can't be when you can within a system, because we don't always have the power to do that. I think I've been very lucky because even though my illnesses have happened at times, where I was doing my training and things like that, I also had established a really solid career. I knew my own worth as a therapist and as a worker. And so that's meant that I've been able to actively advocate for myself and my clients in a way that you don't always when you're a new graduate. And I'm really aware, and I'm quite lucky that I've been able to build a career first. But even if you haven't, just be kind to yourself and be aware that it's okay to be human. We can't do this work without being people. So just let yourself. And I think the other thing to think about is that any one of us could have a crisis strike at any time, because that's part of being human, yeah. So I want listeners to really think about how you would navigate if you suddenly just couldn't be there. Like, what would you want clients to know? What would you want managed? Do you have a professional will? Certainly in Australia, if you're a psychologist, you should have some form of professional will. Working in an NGO, I didn't need to write one out or have agreements with other providers. But if you work in private practice, you need a professional will. You need to have other practitioners who've said, yes, if you have a crisis, I will take your caseload. Don't assume that it's never going to happen to you, because that's not how life works. My hope is that none of the listeners have quite the same number of issues that I've had in my 30s, but you never know. So do really think about how you would manage and what you would do both to look after yourself and support your caseload, even when you can't be there if something sudden happens in your life.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ceara. If the listeners want to find out more about you, do you have anything that you want them to? It doesn't have to be about you. It could be like, do you want them to find out more about a particular topic? Is there any way you want them to find you?
Yeah, well, look, if you want to find me, I'm really easy to find. Google my name. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Also, if you want to learn more about voluntary assisted dying, including a few little snippets that I've written, visit the website for Go Gentle Australia, and you'll find some really good information there. If you're in the Australian Psychological Society, the wonderful Heather Gridley wrote a fantastic discussion paper on VAD in the lead up to it becoming legalised in Victoria, that really goes through the issues well in an Australian context. But Go Gentle Australia has some really good information too.
Fantastic. I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well so listeners can access it. That'd be really good. Ceara, I just want to thank you again for sharing this side of yourself and just sharing yourself with the listeners. I think it would be really beneficial for listeners, for early career therapists, to hear that, yes, personal crises do strike, and they can strike multiple times over a number of years, as we've seen with you. And it is possible, I guess, to, like you said, have some sense of getting through this, but also lots of acceptance of the difficult feelings that accompany it. And thank you for sharing this with us.
Yeah, very happy to. Thank you, listeners. I hope you got something out of hearing my story.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, listeners, for listening. You've been listening to Mental Work, and catch you later. Have a good one. Bye.